by 13 virgins. And of course, there's the tale behind that, because the artist Bermidi actually went out and found ladies of the evening to pose for his virgins.
Dan Brown's professor left that part out of his story. But Brown's Professor Langdon does speak of another controversial work of art that held court in the Rotunda, a half-naked sculpture of George Washington as the Greek god Zeus. It's true.
It implies that Washington held this very, very special role in American society. And every time the other founders had their backs up against the wall and one person had to be picked as the leader of all the leaders, it was George Washington. And the people of America knew that. And there's never been a president who was as beloved by more people in America than George Washington. And one newspaper man once wrote an article that if George Washington runs for president, he'll get every vote. And he didn't mean every electoral vote. He meant every single vote from every single American.
So perhaps George Washington was godlike then. But why a Greek god? And why was he bare-chested?
The Congress purchased a statue of Washington. They were a little embarrassed when they unveiled it and found out that Washington was wearing very little other than a small lap robe.
The public hated it, and one of the first comments somebody made as soon as it was unveiled was it looked like he was coming out of the bathtub reaching for a towel.
When Nathaniel Hawthorne looked on the statue, he said, even Washington's own mother never saw him naked.
The statue was moved from the Capitol in 1964 and now resides in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. But another reminder of Washington's legacy remains in the Capitol, just as the book suggests.
There's a star inlaid in the floor down the crypt of the Capitol. Now, they had intended actually to bury George Washington in the Capitol underneath that star, and it would have been very symbolic. Washington's tomb, which never was used by Washington, is still down underneath that central star.
Although it's not addressed in the book, the answer to why Washington was never buried in the Capitol goes back to the night he died. In December 1799, at the age of 67, Washington lay dying from a bad throat infection. Just before his death, weakened by his bloodletting treatment, he had Martha do him one last favor.
He had written 2 wills, and so both copies of the wills were brought up to him, and he said, burn this one in front of me. We'll never know what was different about the will that was burned. The nation basically went into shock. I mean, they just could not believe that George Washington died. And it was really a state of mourning for the entire country.
Funeral, grand honors.
He was buried at Mount Vernon in a Masonic service.
His soul to God who gave it, and commit his body.
Martha herself was so shaken and upset, she didn't even attend the funeral.
Opinions differ to this day as to where Washington wanted to be buried, the Capitol or Mount Vernon.
Well, Washington himself wanted to be buried in his vault on Mount Vernon. And those were his instructions, and it was clear and simple.
He was planning to go to the vault in the Capitol, and unfortunately Martha died, and then the promise was withdrawn. And they just didn't get the thing built in time. Martha Washington then died, and the heirs of Washington decided that no, they were going to reverse Martha's decision.
His final wishes are still a mystery. His remains may not be entombed in the Capitol building, but his influence is still visible. The brotherhood he belonged to still remains to this day. Freemasons, a secret society, or a society with secrets. In The Lost Symbol, Dan Brown depicts the Masons as being the country's most powerful secret society.
We're everywhere. Few other organizations can claim 14 presidents as having been a member.
The book describes a private Masonic room inside the U.S. Capitol building. It's called a chamber of reflection. Is this right? Does such a room exist? Or has the book amped up the truth for dramatic effect?
The chamber of reflection is real. There are lodges that do that all around the world. A lot of American lodges don't do it, some do. Even those that do don't necessarily do it in quite the particularly lovely fashion that Dan Brown describes, but that is the classic fashion.
Here, members meditate in solitude amid symbols of time and death. A skull to remind men of mortality and equality. Salt to represent the body, mercury the soul, and sulfur the spirit.
In some Masonic obediences, the chamber of reflection, you're placed in there and you're actually asked to write your will to make you contemplate your own mortality.
Disturbing, perhaps to the uninitiated, but the Masons see it much differently.
The point of it is not to creep out the candidate, oh, there's a skull. The point of it is the theme of mortality. Your time on earth will end. Your time on earth is short. So while you're here, focus on what's important in your life.
The way the chamber of reflection is depicted in Dan Brown's book is it's presented as though a Mason might have that in his office somewhere, or maybe even in his home. And that isn't really true.
And are these chambers of reflection hidden in the sub-basement of the Capitol building, as described in the book?
There are a variety of levels from the attic down to the sub-basements.
What you're seeing is actual archival footage of the sub-basement as depicted in the book. It no longer exists.
They were demolished for the construction of the Capitol Visitor Center, which opened just in 2008.
And did anyone use them for their own purposes, Masonic or otherwise?
There are rooms in the sub-basement of the Capitol, not that I know of being used by Masons.
So the Chamber of Reflection is real, but Brown's placement of one inside the U.S. Capitol building is fiction. In the book, a student describes the Masons as a religion, but Professor Langdon disagrees. He argues they never try to convert, and in fact are prohibited from discussing religion.
Drop in on the lodge. You might find something of interest there for you, because Masons don't recruit. So we depend on the word getting out other ways.
Bring the candidate in from the chamber of
Also,
reflection.
contrary to Brown's villain's claims, money doesn't move you up the ranks of Masonry.
The way it really works is that somebody becomes a regular Mason, the first 3 degrees, then they go through the other degrees of the Scottish Rite from the 4th degree to the 32nd degree, but you can't buy your way into the 33rd degree, especially on the express route that's mentioned in the book. Shame on Dan Brown for saying that.
In The Lost Symbol, Dan Brown describes several Masonic rituals. While some of his elements are based in fact, the real ceremonies are kept secret.
I'm not going to talk about the actual methods of recognition from one Mason to another. I'm not going to give certain details of the ritual, not because there's anything bad about them, but just because we don't talk about the details of the ritual. That's best done out of sight. That's best done confidentially and privately.
This reenactment was staged with the help of another Master Mason to better understand the method of their perceived madness.
The candidate is brought into the lodge without really knowing what the experience will be like. The candidate at the beginning doesn't even see the lodge because the candidate is ritually blindfolded. The candidate is led to walk around the lodge in a certain pattern. Freemasonry is built around ritual initiation. Ritual initiations that themselves are built around the use of symbols.
The rituals are a nod to Masonic origins.
The meaning of other Masonic rituals